All right, so in this video, we're going to be focusing in on scatter plots and trend lines. So the first thing we have to do is we have to understand what exactly is a scatter plot. All right, so a scatter plot is just that. If I were to scatter something all over the floor, it's just a bunch of data on a graph, and it's showing the relationship between two sets of data. So as my x travels to the right, what is happening to the y? All right, so a scatter plot is simply dots on a graph showing forms of relationships. Now there's two things that I can find within my scatter plot. One thing is called a cluster. Now I will not always have clusters, it's only sometimes. A cluster is when I have data grouped together closely. So a cluster is data grouped together closely. The next term that we have, and again, we don't always have one, is we have what's called an outlier. And an outlier is a piece of data that doesn't belong with the rest of it. So this one's kind of floating in its own little world. Therefore, it would be called an outlier. Now with scatter plots, there are three different types of associations. Association means as my x moves to the right, as it increases, what's happening to the y? So in this first association, as my x value floats to the right, so as it increases, my data of the y also increases, causing a upward slope. This would then be a positive association. In this next graph, as my data increases, there's a decline of my y data. So as there's an increase of my x, there's a decline of my y. So my data is going down, which means that there is a negative association. And then lastly, as my data increases, there is upwards and downwards happening throughout this, which means that there is no correlation. So there's a positive correlation, negative correlation, or no correlation. So again, this is simply meaning as my x values increase, there's always an increase of the x from left to right, what is happening then to the other parts of data? All right. The other part of scatter plots that we work with is trend lines, and we can use these trend lines to make predictions. So we can use trend lines to make predictions. So what does that mean? So first thing we have to understand, what is a trend line? A trend line is a straight line that goes through the data, so it's linear, okay? Notice it goes through the data. It goes through the data. It goes in the data. All right, so a couple things. We need to ignore the outliers. So we need to ignore those extra pieces of floating data, and it cuts through it with about the same number of points above and below. All right, so here I have a piece of data. All right, this would be a negative correlation because it's going down from left to right. Okay, so what a trend line is it is a straight line. So I have here a string, and it cuts through the data with about the same amount above and below. All right, so notice I'm not going to put the line below it. I'm not going to put the line above it. I need to swim through the data. All right, so I kind of like to start by tracing my finger from the top piece to the bottom piece, because that's going through the data, and that way it gives me kind of a guideline as what my slope of my line could be. So I'm going to kind of start it at this top point. All right, notice right now I have 4 dots below and I have 6 dots above. So that's not acceptable in our land. So I'm going to keep my trend line snug on the top, and I'm going to kind of rotate this bottom piece. And as I do that, I'm going to bring my top just down a little bit. I'm changing the tilt. All right, so notice I'm going through a dot here. So tilt, tilt. So I'm kind of happy here. I have 4 dots below. I'm going through a dot and a half, and I've got 4 dots above. So it would be in this spot that I would want to draw my trend line. Now, if I was using a ruler, I'd probably be better off than using this string, but I can tilt this down. I'm going to take my pencil, and I'm going to go ahead and trace this line that I'm using, and then I move. Okay, so the question is, does this trend line go through my data? Now, I think I could have tilted it maybe a little bit further down, but notice 1, 2, 3, 4 dots below, 1, 2, 3, 4 dots above, and I have 2 dots on. All right, so again, I could have shifted down just a little bit more, but that's just approximate of what I'm working with. So yeah, I think I would have liked it better down here. My tracing got a little bit off there down at this bottom. There we go. All right, I can then make a prediction using this line. So once I have this trend line, so once I draw this, I can use it to approximate what result could be given other data. Okay, so we're going to take a look at how I can now make a prediction with this trend line. So here I have another scatter plot. This scatter plot shows the distance in miles I travel and how much time it takes me. So the longer I'm running, the more time it takes, which makes sense. Now, a lot of times you guys like to call this an outlier. It's not, because it's going along with the trend. If the dot was floating in some of these white spaces, that's when it would be considered an outlier. All right, so our first step in this is we're going to draw a trend line. All right, so again, we have our ruler or our string. Now, please note, I do not have to start at 0, 0. All right, in this case, no distance traveled at no time. I'll probably want to hook it to 0, 0. All right, so I'm going to start kind of below my data, and I'm going to start swinging this up. I'm going to turn it so it's this direction. All right, so again, I want to go through the bulk of my data, so I'm thinking this spot kind of looks good. All right, same amount of dots above and below, and I'm going through that other dot. All right, so I'm going to start here. I'm going to kind of put my trend going through this data. Okay, so once I have this trend line, I can use it to fill in the empty spaces between or beyond. So here's our first question. It says, how long is she going to run at 4.5 miles? So my first task is to find, well, where is 4.5 miles? So my bottom is miles, my left is minutes. So I'm going to be using this x-axis, and I'm looking for 4.5, which I'm going to locate right here. So this is 4.5. I'm then going to travel all the way up until I hit my trend line. And then once I hit that trend line, I'm ignoring all the other dots. I'm going to then go over to my axis to find out my time. So I'm slightly above 45, so I would say about 46 minutes. So that would be my estimation. Okay. The next question says, how far am I going to run, or is she going to run at 35 minutes? So again, I check my label of minutes. So I'm working over here with minutes, and 35 would be right here on this line. So I'm now going to track over to the trend line. I hit the trend line, and now I'm going to shoot straight down. All right, I'm just below probably 3.5. So we'd say maybe what? How far will I run? I'll probably run 3.4 miles. And again, those are approximate. I'm using my data. Usually it's plus or minus a couple of them. All right, so hopefully this helped you out with scatter plots and trend lines.